Hello and welcome back. This channel, the Way To Native Chronicles, exists partly to challenge views that often go unexamined, not out of disrespect, but out of a deep belief that truth really does matter, especially when it's uncomfortable. Today's topic is one of those truths, and it won't be easy for everyone to hear. We often hear that colonization brought suffering to Indigenous people, and it did. But rarely do we ask the critical question, compared to what? Let's take a realistic, honest look at Indigenous life before Europeans arrived in what is now Canada. We'll talk about hardship, war, slavery, and life expectancy, and compare that to what followed for better or for worse. And finally, if colonization was inevitable, and history suggests it was, we'll ask, would colonization by Western Europeans have been better or worse than colonization by some of the other expanding powers in the world at that time? There's a romanticized view that Indigenous life before European contact was peaceful, healthy, and in perfect harmony with the land. But that's more myth than fact. Let's talk hardship first. Life expectancy was low. Most hunter-gatherer societies had an average lifespan hovering around 30 to 40 years, with high infant mortality rates and death from infection, injury, or famine. Starvation wasn't uncommon. Long winters, failed hunts, or depleted resources could mean death. Medical knowledge was deeply spiritual, but extremely limited. Infections and injuries that are treatable today were often fatal. Now let's talk warfare. Pre-contact life wasn't peaceful. Intertribal warfare was frequent and brutal. Indigenous nations raided each other for resources, revenge, and even captives. Some groups, like the Blackfoot Confederacy, were powerful military forces who expanded territory through conquest. Warriors were revealed, and for good reason. Constant readiness for conflict was a part of survival. And yes, there was slavery too. Captives taken in war were often enslaved, sometimes adopted, sometimes tortured or executed. Among some Pacific Northwest tribes, slavery was hereditary and could last generations. None of this diminishes the cultural richness, courage, or complexity of Indigenous civilizations, but it does mean that the narrative of idyllic pre-contact life simply doesn't hold up to honest scrutiny. European colonization brought terrible costs. Let's not pretend otherwise. Epidemics wiped out large portions of the population. Smallpox, influenza, and measles ravaged communities with no immunity. Land was taken, ways of life were disrupted, and yes, residential schools tried to strip children of their language and culture, a shameful chapter that still casts a shadow today. But that's not the whole story. Alongside the tragedies came new tools, knowledge, and systems that dramatically improved quality of life over time. Modern medicine extended life. Antibiotics, vaccinations, and surgery helped end deaths from infection, injury, and childbirth. Agriculture and food preservation brought food security, even through hard winters. Written language and education opened doors to global knowledge and advocacy. Rule of law and democratic institutions, while flawed, created frameworks for Indigenous people to eventually demand rights, treaties, and justice. Technology, from the wheel to the rifle, from electricity to the internet, revolutionized daily survival and opened up entirely new ways of life. Today, Indigenous people live longer, have access to medicine, and engage globally, not in spite of the West, but partly because of it. Now, let's get uncomfortable a bit. What if Europeans hadn't come? Would things have turned out better? Maybe. But let's be honest, colonization was going to come from somewhere. The 15th through 19th centuries saw powerful civilizations expanding globally. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the Russians, the Chinese, the Ottomans, and eventually the Japanese. Because by that time, many of these civilizations had developed far more advanced technology, maritime navigation, metallurgy, and military organization. The disparity in technology meant that encounters between indigenous societies and expansionist powers were not encounters of equals. The side with steel weapons, ocean-going ships, written languages, and mass production had a distinct and overwhelming advantage. The world was becoming interconnected, and isolated regions like North America were bound to be drawn into that expanding web. Whether it had been Britain and France or Russia and China, or someone else entirely, powerful empires with superior force and organization were going to expand. Imagine if instead of Britain and France, it had been, let's say, Imperial China, with its strict top-down imperial structure and total control over culture and movement. Or let's say it would have been the Ottoman Empire, with religious minorities being tolerated, but always as second-class citizens, paying extra taxes and living under Islamic dominance. Or the Russian Empire, known for brutal suppression of indigenous Siberians and forced relocations. The British, for all their faults, brought with them ideas of common law, individual rights, and eventually democracy. Those very principles are what allow us to speak freely, protest injustices, and demand better. In many ways, indigenous peoples have used these same Western ideals to push back and rebuild. As we compare civilizations and their values, we can't ignore one of the most influential forces in Western history, Christianity. Before it spread, most societies, including those in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, operated on a principle best described as might makes right. Power, wealth, and strength determined who mattered. The weak, whether women, children, slaves, the elderly, or the infirm, were often treated as expendable. This included slavery. It's uncomfortable to say, but it's historically accurate. Slavery was practiced nearly everywhere in the world. It wasn't unique to any one culture or continent. Indigenous peoples practiced it. Africans practiced it. Asians, Europeans, Arabs, all did. What made the difference was not that the West invented slavery, because it didn't, but that eventually the West ended it. And that turning point came largely through the influence of Christian teachings. Christianity introduced a radical idea that all human beings are created in the image of God, possessing equal and inherent dignity. From that came moral obligations. The strong are to protect the weak. The rich must care for the poor. Masters are accountable to God. Rulers serve the people, not themselves. These weren't just lofty ideas. Over time, they laid the groundwork for profound change. It was Britain, for all its colonial faults, that became the first major power to abolish the slave trade, and eventually slavery itself, across its empire. This didn't come cheap. The Royal Navy patrolled the seas to suppress the transatlantic slave trade, costing British taxpayers a fortune and leading to the deaths of British sailors who never owned a slave. Why did they do it? It's because enough people believed that it was morally wrong, and that belief was rooted in Christian conscience. From that same moral root grew hospitals, orphanages, universal education, and eventually the very human rights language that activists, indigenous and non-indigenous alike, use today for fighting for justice. Have Christians always lived up to their ideals? Of course not. But the ideals themselves, equality, compassion, justice, were revolutionary, and they changed the world. So when we assess colonization, we have to acknowledge that along with the terrible wrongs came a worldview that introduced entirely new ideas of justice, rights, and human dignity, many of which still guide our society today. This is not about denying the suffering caused by colonization. It's about placing it in a real-world context. If reconciliation is to mean anything, it must be built on truth, not just about what was done to Indigenous people, but about the realities of pre-contact life and the full legacy, good and bad, of Western influence. To simply blame colonization for all present-day issues is to ignore the strength, wisdom, and agency Indigenous people still carry today. It's also a missed opportunity to ask what can we keep that's good and what should be rebuilt, and how can we move forward with eyes open and truth in hand. If you made it this far, thank you. Not everyone wants to hear hard truths. But if we only ever speak what people want to hear, then we're really not seeking truth at all, right? We're just repeating dogma. If you appreciate content that challenges mainstream narratives and digs deeper than slogans, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and consider sharing it. And in the comments below, respectfully, let me know your thoughts. Because truth doesn't belong to one side. It's a path we walk together, step by step. Thanks for watching the Way to Native Chronicles. See you next time. Did you like this video? If you did, I think you're gonna like this one right over here. So check it out. And I appreciate your subscribing if you haven't done so already. Remember to do that while you're watching this next video. Click like, it all helps us out for this channel. Catch you next time.